mitigation buyouts. Everybody loves those. Oh, wow.
Steve, this is Lauren. I guess on going to your out-of-state diversions. So your recommendation was just legislation is needed to develop that. That seems to me to need a little more definition. I mean, legislation is needed to promote out-of-state diversions or to prevent out-of-state diversions, or I know right now we're working as 5 states with the Upper Mississippi River Basin on some of those kind of Mississippi Basin diversions, which represents quite a bit of Illinois. Do we need to say, continuing to collaborate to create legislation that supports some of the ongoing diversion efforts? I'm looking just maybe for a little more meat to that, because that's a pretty generic statement, I think, on the out-of-state diversions.
Yeah, we could certainly beef that up quite a bit. I think a lot of it is kind of. I think we do need to have that group convene to come up with something. So I think we need to have a group of folks that are already working with that right now, which many of which are within DNR, to maybe draw up what we're looking for with with a diversion, and then some of that could be coming out of what is going to be discussed at UMRBA, because I imagine the other states are going to be in the same boat with if we do move forward, or they'll probably have some interest in that, because they're not just approaching Illinois, they're also approaching the other states as well.
Hey, again, I'll pause a moment just to see if there's any final comments or questions regarding the water use and regulations section. You should be seeing it up on the screen, the table that Steve has gone over. So I'll give a minute and see if anybody has any final comments.
This is Lauren again. On the building code, are we recommending a particular building code, or that we create something from scratch, or?
Well, we need to convene a group with, and then we did talk about that a little bit, is we need to convene a group to see who's going to have a stake in this. Obviously DNR is, and we need to convene a group to see what we can and can't do. And I mean, obviously the governor's got some interest in a building code coming off of the tornadoes that we had last week. When we talk about building code, it's not just going to live in one entity. And I think, with water resources, I know that we have an interest with regard to NFIP and with regard to getting grant money. I think that it needs to be broadened out, obviously working with, other state agencies and probably local communities that actually have building codes.
Hey, Steve, this is Tara. I might add that I had sat in a Silver Jackets project, award-winning project last week, and they got a bunch of brick awards for the state of Nebraska, and they had adopted the International Building Code.
Yeah.
And they indicated that was what the code they adopted, and that helped them get the brick.
Right.
So.
That is kind of what happened when they had a lot of the brick rewards awards for that, is that a lot of these groups that did get that was the one thing they did have in common. I know there could be some change in stance with FEMA with regard to brick, because of there's been a significant amount of pushback on that, because of looking at these states that do have state building codes. How well are they applying them is also a question, and how much does it actually impact floodplain management? So.
Okay, any final comments? Hearing none, I guess we will wrap up the water use and regulations section. And by what Krista's presented, she said that Jeff will be presenting the funding. Is that correct, Chris? And Jeff, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
All right. I will queue up your section here and let you get started.
All right. Well, thanks. Chris, did you want to say anything first, or Gary, before I start?
I am happy leaving it all in your capable hands, or if Gary wants
Okay.
to say something.
I'd say have at it, Jeff.
All right. Well, Chris, Gary, and I have been working on this one for a little bit here to look at the long-term funding issues. And this is something that's, as we all know, cuts across all the agencies, departments, a lot of different organizations throughout the state, and it's also cutting across all the chapters. So we took the process of, looking at what our water resource needs, what are the state water activities that we're funding, and what's the funding need categories that we've identified throughout all the other chapters that we're working on. Also, what are some of the technology and capital needs to improve state operations, and then looking at local funding needs as well, because that's an important partner in all of this. And also looking at things like the state revolving loan fund as an example for dealing with other issues that aren't covered by the revolving loan fund. And then in terms of recommendations, these are sort of early the issues to consider that we need to wrestle with a little bit more. So when we're dealing with funding, we're getting the operating revenues, state capital budgets, state and federal grants, revolving loan funds, federal funds, user fees, a whole host of things. And what we're looking at from what others working on the report here are looking at, there's a need for one-time capital funding for larger projects. There's a need for new one-time funding for planning or study. And then also for programmatic funding, maintaining existing state funding for certain programs, increasing state funding for other programs, and then providing new ongoing state funding for new programs or needs. As part of this, there's a lot of the different offices, agencies, departments are looking at technology and looking at our own internal operations and how we're dealing with things. And can technology make things easier, get us better information? For instance, water, the water quality unit is looking at how can they collect data more effectively using technology out in the field. And how do we do that, and what kind of investment is needed up front to improve all of that? So, we're looking at funding for resource planning, watershed planning, coordination among multiple communities, water, wastewater facility planning, local communities understanding asset management better for their own water resources, technical and financial assistance for environmental justice communities, looking at the problem of local match, some communities not having local match for funding coming from the state or the federal government, and then getting to the idea of how do we construct some of these projects. So we've looked at the revolving loan fund that deals with water and wastewater. There's money that's put into that at the upfront, and then it's loaned out to communities and they pay it back with interest, and it keeps building up. So you've got a bigger fund to deal with water and wastewater operations and infrastructure. And that has a limited focus. So, thinking about that as maybe a model for one way of getting longer term funding for things that need to get dealt with. So in looking at the recommendations and issues for consideration, we're looking at getting more dedicated state funding for integrated water resource management planning, potentially establishing a new state-funded state revolving loan program that mimics the current SRF program that provides funds for long-term water resource management needs that aren't addressed by that existing IEPA SRF program.
Yeah, I wanted to interrupt real quick. Sorry,
Sure.
This is Tara, and I think you're new to this task force, so welcome, first of all, and we appreciate your efforts so far. But in general, when we're doing these sections, we do have a table of recommendations. So I tried to take your table or your recommendations and start populating the table. And if you could just talk one by one so we can address each issue and recommendation, and then we can give input as you go forward. So for the first one of the criteria when we developed our recommendations was that it needs to be something actually a measurable task. So at the end of our 5 years or however long we do this water plan, or when we make our next update, we wanted to be able to say that we addressed these particular issues. So with your first one, I think it makes a lot of sense but it might be a little vague, and it might need a little bit more detail as yes, we know we need funding, but we might need to say, water resource management planning might be a little vague, but I understand where you're coming from because you're trying to cover all of the sections and all of the critical water needs that have said that we need funding. So I'm not sure how to address this one per se, so I open it up to the group.
And Tara, this is Chris, and thank you for pointing out the table. I forgot about that. For this one, I think part of what we're trying to say is that all of the state agencies and the staff that are supposed to be updating this plan every 5 years need to have confirmation that we should be using some of our resources to implement it. So we could look at it from a cost per agency and actually set a dollar amount, or it could be something where the agencies say, hey, we don't even want to mess with trying to identify it as a budget item. So I would welcome comments from the other agencies on how they would want to handle this concept. And then Gary and Jeff, if there's more to that recommendation than what I just alluded to, please clarify that at this point as well.
Well, I think in one of the other chat, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, when I read this, I thought it really meshed well with Lauren's recommendation in his section about setting up the Water Resource Center or hub and provide funding to everybody through that hub. That might be one approach, but that's just one idea, and that's why I said to coordinate this particular recommendation with Lauren's section.
And actually, I think that when we were going through the chapters, that one jumped out as we were reviewing it. So I think that one's more the inspiration for it. So. And it also, I think, links to the next one about potentially using a model of a revolving loan fund for other resources or for other needs, not covered by the current revolving loan fund, because that way money goes out, but it also comes back in as well. So it will, it starts to address getting some sustained funding to other areas. And again, the next one is additional funding resources. We're coming up with different models that might be able to approach that or to deal with those kinds of issues. Any thoughts on that?
This is Lauren. I like, the concept, and I think we've chatted about that as agencies before about kind of expanding the state revolving fund. I think we'd have to try and be able to defend what we'd want those kinds of dollars for. For example, on, flood control, the state can come in under some of our authorities, and, we can cover perhaps 100% of construction. And so basically it's not a grant. We're not running a grant program, but we would enter into, say, an agreement with a community to, let's just say, build a flood wall. And, they might provide the land rights and we provide all the construction dollars. And so, there's not a need for a revolving fund for, say, some flood control efforts. Green infrastructure might be a lot different, right? It's maybe tougher we need something for stormwater nuisance flooding or something that may not drive enough dollars out of a flood control program, but in that case allows the community the capability to access dollars from a loan perspective to have some capital to do something. So I guess I'm in favor of exploring how, what that revolving fund expansion needs to include, I guess.
Yeah, this is Gary with the SRF program. I think our thoughts were that there needs to be a new program, another program outside the current SRF program. And what Jeff and Chris and I struggled with was taking a look at all the recommendations that had been made by the various folks so far. There were so many requests for not just continuing with existing funding, but new funding. And I personally struggle with the amount of new funding that is being put into this document and how successful the group could possibly be. I mean, there's only so much new funding that's going to be on the horizon. I think there needs to be some type of prioritization amongst the group as to how much are you realistically going to ask for. And if legislators are going to look at this and be overwhelmed with the amount of new funding, I think it loses some of its, I don't know if credibility is the right word, because everything in here is definitely credible. But I think sometimes when you go asking for money and you ask for too much, you come up on the short end of your request. So whether it's the hub or a state agency, I think the success of the current state revolving fund loan program could be used as an example to successfully get new money, seed money, to start a new program that could address whatever an advisory board would choose to prioritize, either on a 5-year basis or an annual basis. But we really struggled with trying to either capture all the existing funding requests or come at this from new funding angles. And I'll stop there.
Gary, this is Wes. I couldn't agree with you more. It's great to ask for all these things, but we got to put in some kind of perspective or priority order that maybe the group can come to a consensus on, and maybe that's a separate section within the report on how we prioritize those funding requests. And, I don't think it's the intent for us to be competing with one another for a set amount, so it'd be beneficial for us to all kind of be on the same page or relatively the same page for what is the state's top priorities among all these recommendations that we do have.
And this is Chris. One of the things, and Rick Cobb started us off with this chapter a couple of years ago, and when we initially started, basically it looked like everybody was just getting ready to put a letter together to Gary saying, hey, we need your money. And his program really does have a specific mission that covers a significant amount of water issues in the state of Illinois, but there's many things that are not available through his program that need to be addressed. So the concept and the recommendation here, no matter what's identified or prioritized for funding, is that the state really does need a separate program that mimics the structure of the Illinois EPA State Revolving Loan Program, where money goes out and then is repaid over time so that it can go back out again. But we open it up to a lot more different topics or issues or programs or projects.
Help me understand too that the state revolving fund, that the primary focus is on water supply and wastewater. Is that
Correct? Yeah, and stormwater. Stormwater is now an eligible category, but the main focus historically is anything to do with wastewater collection and treatment, and anything to do with water treatment and distribution from beginning to end. So we're giving funding to municipalities, water districts, sanitary districts. And when you go make these requests for new funding, the whole premise of the State Water Revolving Fund is that there's an annual amount of seed money. In our case, it's provided by the feds, but it's a fraction of the funding that is available, and that's not going to happen overnight if you start a new program. But as time goes by, as the decades pass, currently our annual seed money, if you will, from the feds is about $70 million, but we're able to provide $600 million in funding. Now, obviously, it started out on a much smaller scale, but I think to request that a type of program like this be started, you could start out obviously on a much smaller scale, but I think you can attack and fund things that the traditional SRF program can't. And it is well known by legislators. It is a proven success story. They know what it does. They see it impacting their communities. We're providing funding that is, if you're going to borrow money, it's the best deal in town. And it could be used as an example to start something. You know, maybe you only ask for seed money from the state to the tune of $10 or $20 million. But you can show where it's going to end up 10, 15, 20 years from now. And it is a program that will be here forever.
This is Tara, and I think this idea is great, and I think some of the other categories or topics have suggested the need for this. My question might be, and it might be a stupid question, but is there a way that IEPA expands their existing program to cover some of these, since you already have the tools in place and some of the staffing, and assuming we would bring in more staff to help it, or it could be a separate program through EPA that covers all these things. But I'm just wondering what agency would actually implement that, and does it not make sense to just expand or duplicate what's done within EPA and have it stay within EPA?
Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. It would be a duplication. The current SRF program has so many ties to federal strings and the federal money and US EPA that it's going to have to continue on its own path. But you certainly could duplicate just a state model. Now, whether it's with IEPA or you know, another agency or even the hub, I'll leave that up to the group. But we do have a staff in place. You probably have to, you know, we have about, no, we're almost up to 20 people that run this program. So if you could, you know, convince the legislators that this was a good idea, you'd have to probably start with a staff of maybe 10 folks to get this up and rolling. But I'm not the person to decide which agency is appropriate for that.
Well, and this is Chris. part of it would come down also to what you determined would be eligible for the program, because it may be that it would have multiple areas that it could help fund, and one might be more of a recreational benefit. Another might be, say, private loans for individual homeowners for repairing or replacing septic systems. So I think the long term, it's going to have to be, you know, first, can we mimic this? What are the top areas we would want to fund, and where is the appropriate place to manage it?
Yeah, this is Lauren. I guess I could see a need for, and building off of like urban flooding, right? To deal with some urban flooding, but that almost gets to a property by property kind of issue there. I guess in my mind, I'm struggling with what would be eligible for a new fund that wasn't water supply or wastewater. If it's flood control, there are already, you know, kind of authorities and agencies that can go get dollars for that. So where's the new need there?
Lauren, how about things like conservation practices that are identified in watershed-based plans? The other thing is, and we haven't brought it up because it just dawned on me again, a number of decades ago, the state of Illinois was actually working with individual banking institutions to provide loans directly to agricultural producers for work on agricultural areas, and I think it was for the area of conservation implementation, and then they would pay the loan back that way. So there is another option that if we were able to get funding for this, that maybe an agency would take the lead on it, but maybe local banking institutions would do the legwork and the other work that would need to be done as far as making loans out and receiving payments back in.
I like that idea, you know, from a watershed perspective, is that I don't know if that gets sideways or actually supports like Department of Ag programs.
Where I'm coming from on some of this stuff, I think the Department of Agriculture and Michael Ellett, but what I would say is from the Soil and Water Conservation District's perspective is there is not enough money out there to address all of the needs that the landowners out there are interested in implementing for whether it's protection plus conservation or other items that way. And I had a second absolutely wonderful thought, but it just flew out of my brain. So I'm going to have to stop talking for a minute and recapture it because it's gone.
And something else that the traditional SRF programs can't fund is stormwater type activity that doesn't provide a water quality benefit, and that gets into flooding issues. We're putting just, you know, a typical stormwater system underground for communities that don't have one or have a poor one that needs upgraded. The SRF cannot fund those type of stormwater, and we get a lot of requests for those. You know, we have flooding issues in our community. We just need to put pipes in the ground, and we cannot fund that type of activity. It has to be more of a green infrastructure type stormwater, whether it's a sedimentation basin or overland flow improvements that are going to provide a water quality benefit. So I think there's a lot of areas that the traditional SRF can't fund that a new program could, and there's a need for it. And I could, Minnesota is a state that does a lot of this agricultural type stuff that Chris was touching upon, that we could provide more information on, that starts to delve off into other water resource issues.
And this is Chris again. The idea, the thought flew back into my brain, luckily. One of the things that Illinois EPA is doing right now is working with a number of wastewater treatment facilities that are upstream of water bodies that are impaired by excess nutrients. And those facilities are having to develop something called a NARP, which is a nutrient assessment reduction plan. And so it's kind of an opportunity for the facility either to make the changes within the facility itself or possibly do a form of trading where maybe they are paying a landowner in the drainage area where that facility is at is to reduce the nutrients out on their property instead of addressing it from the facility itself. So in a situation like that, if we had a state-funded program that they could take a loan out on to implement the practices all at the beginning of the process, the money that the community would have been paying to deal with regular operation and maintenance on an annual basis is the funds that they would be paying the loan back with, because they weren't having to do as much operation and maintenance or fixing things that were degrading because projects upstream were delivering more sediment or nutrient there. So there are really way more opportunities for engaging in a program like this than we can even dream of right now. I'll stop.
This is Lauren. I guess I'll add that. That's all very helpful. And maybe we just need to expand. I don't want a 3-page long recommendation, but maybe if we expand to suggest some of those type of needs that could be filled, that gives more weight in my mind to the recommendation. Like you're saying, even the stormwater improvements, that kind of gets into the urban flooding that I just mentioned. That's not tied just to strict water quality. That helps define where the need is in the state to help advance, better water resource management and damage reduction and resiliency and all that good stuff. So maybe we just need to kind of beef it up a little bit to give that better understanding of what that would be.
Okay. Well, or maybe we can actually tie it back to the previous 12 chapters that have identified what it is that they want money for, so that we're not restating things that, say, navigation has identified as a need, or soil erosion identifies in the future, or flood prevention does. So maybe we can pick in and identify sections or something so that it's reinforcing what everybody else has already brought to the table.
Chris, I was going to just say the same thing, and I was cheating a little bit looking at item 3, and I see that you have 3 different main funding resources or methodologies to fund a lot of what we're all asking for. And I think each section leader should go back to their recommendations and figure out which of these categories would fall with their recommendation if they're asking for additional funding. And if it's not, then we need to let you know and you can make another one. But I think I like that idea, because ultimately the whole report needs to tie, and we can refer back to this too for those cross-cutting issues. But I think each section does know what kind of funding they were thinking about and could bring those back to you guys.
Absolutely. I'm going to call the unknown funding source Tara's purse.
I can't laugh on mute.
I definitely was.
And I think it also fits in with a couple of the other recommendations that we're looking at, which is on the local level. I mean, Gary said it right. He said, every municipality has a stormwater utility, even if they don't, or they're operating one, even if they don't have one formally. And there's potential funding associated with that from a local standpoint. So we need to be thinking about some of these things. If you get a loan, you have to repay it somehow, and they're paying for it out of general obligation or general budget right now within municipalities. So looking at that, but also looking at people when we talk about planning, it's also understanding their asset management. What's the value of their infrastructure? What's some of the values of some of the natural infrastructure as well? So it's looking at value so that we can deal with some of the different funding sources. And that would be tied to, say, state or federal funding, where they, on the asset management, looking at that. So, I mean, because it's connected also to other communities that maybe don't have match funding. They don't have the resources, environmental justice communities or other resource challenged communities. Figuring out the ways to get them technical and financial assistance to deal with some of the real problems they're facing at that local level. So I guess bring that one up for discussion by folks. Everyone's quiet on that. And also, so moving on, even, there's a number of recommendations throughout the report talking about getting additional funding for different section or unit or agency operations, and also, thinking about the technology that's available out there that might be able to help do the work and to make decision making. You get your data, you get your information that's turned into knowledge so that you can make better decisions. So thinking about some of those needs as sort of an upfront expense that might make the work go a little bit more easily or better. And then finally, looking at public-private partnerships at the state and local level, where are there opportunities for that? There was a recommendation in one of the sections, and it escapes me now which one, but looking at that, because there are ways, particularly like with stormwater trading these days, where it's being done through a public-private partnership, and looking at ways that funding can be enhanced through those kinds of mechanisms. And I think we've kind of hinted at that a little bit in some of the earlier discussions. So any thoughts from people on those?
Is there a particular action that the state needs to do to facilitate those kind of P3 setups? I think there's a lot of opportunity for that, and particularly bringing in different foundations and those kinds of entities that have maybe even more dollars than the state to accomplish their particular goals. So, but is there something we need to do as a state to make that easier? And should that be part of the recommendation?
I think there's a lot of work going on all over the state. And I think particularly from the standpoint, I mean, at a minimum, I think it's working with different communities to provide some guidance on how these things operate, where they're being used.
Yep. And Lauren, what I would point out is when we've got some of these public and private partnerships, a number of them are using the funds to try to meet permitting requirements, mostly probably Illinois EPA, but there's probably some other agencies involved. So we really do have to engage with them and make sure that what they're proposing to do meets what our permit requirements are prior to them spending a lot of money on it.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't know if there was like legislation or something necessary that would make it easier to do, private public partnerships or the setup provisions for such. I just speaking out of ignorance there, not knowing if there was some overarching need to help facilitate that.
Yeah, that I don't know.
Well, Chris, with these recommendations, I think they're all great. I think some of them might need to be a little bit more specific so that we can determine if they've been met at the end of the day. But I guess I'll lead it to you. I was struggling a little bit with our normal categories because I know your section is a little different than the rest. I know we might not know the lead agency and we might just have to live with that, or depending on what each topic has brought to you, if there are certain agencies that stand out, or one topic or one agency that gets all the money for flooding or something, then maybe we could put DNR. But I guess I needed your help with these funding and actions because I'm not exactly clear, like Lauren was saying, is it legislation, is it policy, is it providing funding for the program to administer these recommendations? If you require, going back to number 4, if you require them to utilize this asset management, that would be a policy or a legislation change. And do we need staff as a program for some agency to administer that, make sure that the agencies or that they are utilizing the asset management and following protocol and submitting reports, that kind of thing. So I think some of these just need to be fleshed out a little bit, and it might get fleshed out when you try to fill in these columns.
Okay, and I agree with you there, and I'm gonna go with 2 comments here. How about whichever agency's name is in the column as the lead, they're the agency that actually gets the cash. So fight amongst yourselves on who wants responsibility for these different things. Just kidding. Okay, but we sorry, we do need to look at, again, maybe the way that we came about this chapter and make sure that everybody's on board with the direction that we took, which was basically to go back and look at all of the other chapters to figure out what was being requested with the logic that we would be supporting what the recommendations are in the other ones. Or if anybody thinks that it should have been its own standalone that didn't necessarily have anything to do with what was getting identified in the other chapters. So that's the first question. But the second question, Tara, I think what we're going to be able to do is when we go back and look again at what the other chapters have identified and figure out which of these tasks match up with which of the different subchapters, we'll be able to answer the question. And maybe navigation for item number 2 would be a policy change. And for recreation, it might be a legislative change. So it may be that we have a number of things, and then maybe what ends up happening with that is we just have to have another call and figure out how to get this to fit within the table that's provided, or if we need to modify the table slightly since the chapter is coming from a little bit of a different angle.
I think on item number 4, as a global stance, it definitely would require legislation, but then each agency would probably have to modify their administrative rules to handle the asset management plan that was required for the specific type of project that was going to be pursued. Like if they're coming to us for a loan for wastewater or drinking water facilities, we would need an asset management plan here in the SRF loan program. If they were going to go get funding from a different agency, that agency's administrative rules may have to be modified to handle the requirement and acceptance and review of an asset management plan. So it's going to be a legislative action to require it across the board, but then each agency's administrative rules would need to be tweaked to weave that into the particular program that it was going to assist. And then the item number 2, again, you're going to have legislation. I don't know that I want to stick IEPA out there as the agency that's going to run a new program. Yeah, I don't know.
I agree with everything you're saying, and I just wanted to throw 2 things out there. We're going to look at the table of contents that we started. at the end of this if we have time, and I think we will. And one of my ideas that, as I started developing the table of contents, is some of our categories like climate change and this funding really do cross all the sections. So is it its own separate topic, or is it something we talk about as a cross-cutting issue or a separate chapter just on funding that doesn't necessarily match the same protocol as some of our other sections? So that's one option. And then, Chris, I just wanted to mention, when we develop our recommendations and decide each section sends you their list of where they think their funding resource should be, I struggle. It's not just simply going to be the category, because I have about 15 recommendations and they might fall under separate types of funding. So it could get quite messy if we try to follow this existing protocol and table to match all the rest. So I'm just throwing that out there. We may end up handling the section differently or separately, but I think this is a great start, and I agree with your approach to look at what the needs were from each section and determine the best ways to fund some of those requests.
Jeff gets credit for that, and I'll say we love messy, so bring it on.
Yes, I'll give kudos to Jeff for wrestling with this, because we banged our head against the walls more than once trying to look at all the other proposals and figure out how to weave them together. Maybe you're right. The funding category is more as a cross-reference, except for some of these new ideas that maybe need to stand out on their own.
Yeah, this is what.
Oh, go ahead.
ahead, Chris. All right, I'll say, I guess coming in initially with this, I didn't see this as a reiteration of every other funding request in the report, but maybe an example I'll give: in water sustainability, we have funding for water supply, and when we went to try and get some kind of dedicated funding source, we were pretty much told that the pot wasn't big enough. It wasn't a big enough ask, and then it kind of led it to the path of, well, can we tie in multiple programs or multiple water issues together to essentially have a big enough pot to have some kind of dedicated funding? So that's an example of what I kind of anticipate as being in this section, is kind of dealing with the bigger funding issue questions rather than a reiteration of, you know, we're asking for this little fund here and some small funding here and some small funding here. I think that's where we kind of have the benefit of, you know, having the SRF as an example, and is there other places where that could be duplicated? So those are the kind of recommendations I guess I had in mind for that would be incorporated in this section, and why it was its standalone section that was kind of a critical issue in itself.
Okay, and I agree with you. I don't want this chapter to be any longer than 6 pages or any of the other chapters out there. So I think if, as people are looking at what they were asking for and what they thought their funding sources were, we're not necessarily going to say, hey, item number 1 was this type of thing. It may be that in this chapter it says, out of the 53 recommendations that were made, 17 of them are one-time short-term fund requests. So there may be some ways that we can, again, reduce it down to specific information, but refer them back to the actual documents here. But bottom line, when you look at the chapter that we provided, we put an opening in there that identified that when the first plan was written in the 1960s, the current governor went and asked for $1 billion for water resource management to get things going. As far as I can tell, we haven't gotten any better than where they were back in 1967. So I think the whole message that I was pushing for in this chapter is we need money for everything. Everyone at the local level needs to be doing a part, but that there needs to be forward action going. But again, I also have to remind myself that this is for the next 5 years. So some of the stuff might end up, instead of saying, hey, start this whole entire program, maybe we start a pilot program to flesh out a public and private something, and actually bring it down into smaller pieces, and hopefully have this plan encourage our funders, whoever they are, to know that Illinois needs a lot, but that we actually can move forward on step one of multi-step actions, so that 5 years from now, we come back in and say, hey, for climate change, we know that we need this, and it's this dollar amount. So that's where I was kind of coming from this whole thing.
Maybe the problem in Illinois is that we don't have a funding agency that is kind of the hub for all the different program fundings. And in most of the states that I'm familiar with, the SRF program is not ran by that state's Environmental Protection Agency or DNR. You know, there's the Minnesota Public Facilities Authority, there's the Indiana Finance Authority, et cetera. And that financial agency is what runs the SRF loan programs and all their other funding programs, but they work very closely with DNR and EPA and all the other ag, et cetera. I'm on the Minnesota site right now, and there's the SRF programs, there's a point source implementation program, there's a small community wastewater program, a transportation revolving loan fund, a water infrastructure fund, a credit. I mean, it just goes on and on. Maybe Illinois needs and I know we have the Illinois Finance Authority, but they don't get into this type of activity. Maybe there needs to be that authority in Illinois that would run the financial side of these funding programs and then coordinate with the specific agencies that have their own expertise or area of knowledge.
Well, that seems like the right kind of direction based on the conversation we've had today about, the needs for these or other funding needs that are coming to light based on their various topics and issues. And I like the idea of, like Chris was saying, perhaps developing it as here's the first step of several steps that we're recommending to get us to this point down the road. And maybe that's more where the focus goes, is into that kind of a new program or a new focused area of the funding. One of the comments I was prepared to make was about how, and we lifted this up in our urban flood awareness report, was that there's some, even inconsistencies on how state dollars are doled out, right? That one authority may say, well, you've got to, show a positive benefit cost ratio and jump through these hoops to get $1, and another program in a different building down the road says, well, here you go, here's $5 million, just report back to us in a couple of years on how you spent it, right? And so there's inconsistencies on what it took for dollars, or the reporting, or requirements of those dollars. And what you were just mentioning really kind of focuses that into one area that would track and monitor and regulate all of those kinds of issues together. The other point I would make, and maybe it ties into your number 3 on the table here, is that again, we wanted the overall state water plan to have this environmental and social justice theme kind of woven in. And I know that within like the Lake Michigan program piece of the state water plan and others, that there's a gap right now between saying, well, we community would like to do X to improve our water supply or our wastewater or even our stormwater systems, but there's particularly with disadvantaged communities a gap in how they get to that point. And of course, the bigger your community, the more capabilities you have and knowledge and consultants you have to know how to get state revolving fund dollars, or how to even petition IEPA for those dollars. That's what we're finding, I know, on the Lake Michigan water, is that there's communities that simply don't have a clue how to do that. And so we're suggesting, coming in and funding a program that would kind of fill that gap to say, well, here's the assistance you need to help prioritize your systems. Where are your problems and what should you do first? And then how do you develop that? How do you define a project and how do you develop the documents, say, that are required to go to a revolving loan fund program to make the educated ask for $2.8 million to replace this much water line or this much sewer line. So I saw that as being, and that's kind of particularly from the social environmental perspective, there are those communities that simply don't have a clue how to do that, nor, or the ability to do that. So how do we create some assistance to get them to the right point to best utilize those state dollars? So that ties in, I think, somewhat to your number 3, and perhaps we expand on that to include some of that. Thank you.
Hey, Lauren, they do have number 6, and I think it's addressing everything you just said.
Okay, thank you. I didn't see that part.
Yeah, and Lauren, I'll add that, reading through the different chapters, I think that popped out particularly from some of the things that Lake Michigan and others have been doing that at DNR have been talking about. So, thinking that local municipal funding issue is, it's a tough one. And, even like putting new fees on their residents is a challenge as well if you're dealing with like a stormwater utility. So you have to think about how all these things will affect different types of communities here.
Hey, Jeff, if I could ask about number 6, I think a lot of our sections have been asking for a group outreach to help them with the technical portions of design and planning, like Lauren was just talking about, and helping them determine what grants and what financial resources are out there. But I know I've also asked in some of my recommendations to actually have grants earmarked just for the social and environmental justice, or somehow earmarked, they get more points, or so many dollars are only earmarked for those types of communities. And I think item 3 does talk about establishing a fund to address those proposed changes to a community. But I'm wondering if number 6 should have, in addition to I'm not sure what you meant by financial support tools, if that's a grant program or some sort of funding source, or if that's just helping them know what funding's out there to go out for. But I think at some point we need to provide grants for those disadvantaged communities. And with those grants, the grants are probably going to be easier for those than the state revolving fund. Thank you.
Yeah, can I suggest for that item that the funding possibly go to the regional planning commissions, and that they are the conduit to provide the technical assistance and help with the funding applications, because some of them are very involved in some of the parts of the state and they're very good at helping communities get funding, but some of them are underfunded and understaffed and almost non-existent in other parts of the state. I know CMAP up north is looking to expand their technical staff and could use the funding to do so and get the expertise. And if they had that in place, they would be a perfect vehicle to go out there and do technical assistance for communities, do asset management plans for communities, and guide them to the funding sources, rate studies, et cetera. So if instead of a lead agency, we could have the regional planning commissions across the state be the entity that is going to get the funding we're asking for.
Yeah, this is Lauren. I guess I'm open to that idea. My mind was going similarly to that. I was against grants, particularly for the disadvantaged communities that wouldn't even know how to best deal with the grants. I was looking, I know from the Lake Michigan perspective of asking for dollars to and keep them in the program where, the program would perhaps have, maybe get consulting firms or whatever resources were necessary, but where that program kept control over that work instead of just saying, well, boom, here you go, Dixmoor, here's a grant for, 300,000 to go do what you need to go do. They're just going to kind of look at you with a blank stare versus coming in and saying, well, let's work with you and help you with this task order that we're going to give consulting firm X to get us from point A to point B. And I could see where the regional planning groups could, play a role in that process as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be much cheaper than going to consulting engineers, and it's going to be much more efficient and productive than giving the money straight to the community and then having them, just stare at you and say, what do we do now?
Gary, this is Wes. That's something we actually currently do with water supply planning is we work through those regional planning councils to help local communities identify issues. Now, with that, we do have to provide some technical expertise beyond their abilities, particularly if we're talking about complex modeling and things of that nature. But we found it works pretty good to get the word out to all the communities so that we can kind of reach everybody and assess who needs the most help as well, because we don't necessarily always have all that local expertise that the Regional Planning Council might.
Right. It's a good tie-in. And as you probably know, some of them are more robust and more accomplished and have more technical ability than others. But if you're already working with them, I think that's a perfect marriage.
And this is Chris. There may be an opportunity for both levels of assistance. With certain programs, CMAP or the Regional Planning Commission is providing the technical assistance for the community to participate in it. And then the other half of it might be something like what the Corps is doing with some of their funding, where they get into an agreement with a community that the community tells them, yes, they have permission to do certain things. And then the Corps subcontracts directly with an outside contractor to physically do the work, and the Corps would manage the project. Now, I'm not saying that us as agencies would manage the project, but it would be something that we could consider doing. This just means, I guess, that we need more work on this chapter and definitely some input from the rest of the leaders of the chapters that are already out there. So where do we need to go next, or can we turn it over to the next topic on the agenda?
Chris, I think that's a good point. That may be good to, maybe pull together some of the other section leaders and dive into these details a little more and work out those issues. So with that, I guess, is there any other final comments or questions to the funding section? Okay, hearing none, I guess, Tara, would you want to share with the team about the outline that we have and just kind of give a quick overview of that?
Yes, bear with me. Because I wasn't logged in, I couldn't get the table of content up, but here it is. So basically, I looked at the original state water plan, and ours is different. Theirs was really getting into the background of the state of Illinois and the needs, and it was about 400 pages long. And I know that our state water plan is not going to be that long. We're cutting to the chase. Our audience is a General Assembly, and we want them to not have to peruse a lot of information that, while helpful, has already been done. So we don't want to just regurgitate the old state plan, and this one has changed over time. So for the introduction, this is going to change a little bit as we go forward, but I tried to I also looked at other state water plans to try to see what kinds of things they were introducing. So this is a compilation of a lot of different state water plans as well as ours, but obviously we're not going to know what's in this introduction until we start writing it. And once we decide where we want to go, we might we might be assigning different people to write these. I know Wes and I are going to do a lot of some of these main sections, but depending on someone's interest. So just keep in mind if you want more work on your plate to think about any of these topics in the introduction that particularly interest you and you want to have a swing at it, certainly reach out to Wes and I. But we know that this is going to evolve as we go forward, just like how we present the data is evolving until we get to the end and combine the sections and do those cross-cutting issues. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. So, but meanwhile, I went ahead and made an introduction, and then the cross-cutting issues could be part of the introduction. We've always talked about describing how all of our issues cross-cut, and then later in the conclusion to talk about how the recommendations cross-cut. So whether this is its own section or part of the intro, I just put it out for now just to make sure that we don't forget about it. And we've also talked about having some of those attachments, figures, those spider web type figures to try to illustrate some of those issues. And we've also talked back and forth for item 5. I went ahead and put that as a section, social and environmental justice. We know that this is a state water plan and not a equity report, but since again, whether we just introduce the topic in the introduction or it's its own standalone section, we'll just see how much information we present for this report and how it's best served. At any point, anyone can interrupt me, but I'm just going to go ahead and finish walking through. And then I really just basically talked about all of our topics. And I don't know if that's going to be a main heading calling critical topics, and these are all subheadings, just to make it clear to the reader what's going on, why these are different than items 4 and 5. But basically, section 6 through all the way down to 18 is just our sections. It would be everyone's written their section, and each one will have an overview, list the issues or discuss the issues, and have the recommendations table. And then at the end, we would have references and links. And again, the references and links could be in the back, an appendix for each section. We'll just decide when we move forward what makes the most sense. I know sometimes when you're reading only one section, it's nice just to have those references right there in the section. And then again, I've got cross-cutting recommendations at the end, just as a standalone, but it might end up being pulled into the conclusions. This gets to the conclusion section, gets into a little bit of what we were talking about, that how are we going to prioritize? We've talked about numbering all of the recommendations consecutively throughout the report. So at the end, we've got a big list of all the recommendations, and at some point we'll have to get together and decide how we prioritize those. And then we've also talked a lot about how will we know when we've reached the metrics and how we've met success. So we might need to discuss that, whether it's here during the section or at the introduction. I just put that as a placeholder so we don't forget that we all have to be able to show that we've met or not reached the recommendations that we put in this report. And then at the end, we definitely, our audience is a General Assembly, so we really want to make it clear to them as to what they need to do, and whether that's pulling in some of those priorities, but really walking them straight forward and making it very clear what we're expecting from them, besides tons and tons of money. And then the last thing is a placeholder. We've always talked about that this would be more of a living document and that we would have an active website that was updated periodically. And when things actually got completed, or we could give an update on the status of some of those recommendations, So at some point, we need to explain that process and what we plan to do there. And obviously, appendices will develop as the project goes forward. But if anyone has any reports that they feel like they've developed as part of writing this, or a lot of resources and things that you don't necessarily want to pull into your section, but feel like it's worth a further discussion, then I think that's where these kinds of discussions can go. And I would just say I struggle a little bit overall when we're doing these recommendations table, because when I read the recommendations for any section besides my own, they're sort of hard to follow, and it would be so nice to have more discussion like we've had on these 6 or 5 weeks of having or 5 different discussions. So I'm not sure the best way to further explain some of these recommendations without making a page on each. So I just throw that out there because maybe the appendix is a way to explain things a little bit better for those that are interested. And then we would have our figures and tables. So any questions or something major that I missed?
Sounds like everybody agrees you just did an awesome job, Tara.
I'll go with that. All right, and I know I'm not sure if I'll post this or I'll send it out to the group, and you guys can look at it a little more carefully. I realize you're just looking at my moving screen, and that's probably not very helpful, but I'll at least get it out there. But it will evolve. But if there's something you guys have done in another report that really worked well, since we have such a large variety of different agencies, we want to do the best of the best. So I think we're all open to suggestions. But moving on, I'll go ahead and pull back up the agenda and let Wes take it away.
Sure, Tara. I guess the next thing I'll kind of mention is our project schedule. I think we're still kind of holding to what we had hoped, to kind of have a draft committee or draft section from each committee in February, March, looking at kind of combining those sections and having kind of a draft report. And I see us likely having a State Water Plan Task Force in March to kind of discuss those. And Terry, yeah, you can pull up the website there. It kind of listed all out, just down a little bit. That's kind of where I'm at, the final report phase as we kind of move past that. I guess backing up a little bit, you can see on that schedule December 16th, that's today. We're looking at the next State Water Plan Task Force. Our final coordination of the topics will be, I guess, our next point of discussion, but it's looking to be late January, early February. And then we can kind of move down to the final report phase where we kind of collaborate a little bit more and get the final sections. I guess it could be a point of discussion if we need more time than February. I mean, it's only essentially 2 months away, and I know there's a lot of time off and also deadlines about this time of year. So I'll open it up to any thoughts about if this needs to be, if we need to go ahead and push it back or give it another month or so. But you can kind of see that schedule laid out on the web page that Tara has pulled up. I guess, is there any thoughts or concerns at this time about how we have this current timeline laid out? Yes, not
I would
hearing.
suggest, since of course I've got a comment, Wes, I'd suggest, because of the later meeting of the last meeting in early maybe February, we just shift everything by 1 month and have the draft sections due March 15th and et cetera. And I think we would still hope to meet our publishing of the report in the summer.
Yeah, I was debating that as well. I guess I kind of wonder if we'll end up changing it again and end up pushing it out a little bit later. I know there's a few sections that still have quite a bit of work and some more meetings and coordination that needs to occur. So again, this isn't a hard schedule, but we could probably go ahead and reflect that as update and push each of those dates back in the final report phase, while holding the summer 2022 for the published report. So essentially that would move the closed public comments to June. So with that, I guess we'll update the seeing a couple thumbs up and some agreement. So we'll do that, and again we'll kind of reevaluate with each of our meetings. So with that, I'll go ahead and dive into our next meeting. And Tara, I'm going to share or steal the screen here from you. We asked you to, for everybody to kind of provide their availability, and this was the outcome. I think we looked at the middle weeks in January, and that just didn't work out, much like the the last week in January here really didn't work out. But it looks like we have a couple of options. Early Monday or late Friday is the options. I guess I'll open it up if there's a preference, but I guess I'd lean towards maybe 9 to 11 or 9 to 12. I don't know if we'd need the full 3 hours, or we kind of have a 1 to 3 or 4, depending on how much time we need there. Probably 2 hours is adequate. Any thoughts or preferences on Monday versus Friday?
This is Chris. I would ask that you try to avoid Fridays unless everybody else is trying to avoid Mondays.
This is Lauren. I like the Monday 9 to 11.
Okay, sounds like Monday 9 to 11, unless anybody else has any further comments or thoughts. Monday 9 to 11 it is. We will work on updating the website, getting out meeting links for the 31st at 9 o'clock. And again, we will be covering the last 2 topics. That will be climate change and erosion and sedimentation. So looks like those individuals have marked that they are available at that time, so there's no conflicts there. With that essentially concludes what we have for the agenda. Is there any other general topics, questions, concerns anybody wants to bring up to the group? I know we're getting into the lunch hour, so nobody's going to be that person that extends the meeting even longer. All right, very good. Lauren, do you want to, you have anything for the group or anything you want to wrap up the meeting with?
No, just appreciate everybody's time today and some continued great discussions. I think that's what the task force is charged to do. So thank you, everybody, for engaging, and look forward to pressing forward. We have still a lot of work ahead of us. I know even for myself, I've got quite a bit of homework to do for my section. So we press on, and I hope everybody has great holidays and a Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.